So, hi Tabitha, it's so good to see you. And um, we are really excited about this season in the life of really what advocates for immigration changes are involved with because there is so much potential.
Mhm.
I can't imagine. I guess I don't want to sound like a Martin Luther King moment, but I have a dream when these conversations are things in history books where people say, why were we talking about these things? Why were these issues even important? Why did people react so strongly? Because the immigration journey that I've watched in so many people's lives is beautiful. Um, but coming into the United States as an immigrant, there's also things that are not beautiful. And I imagine that as we talk today, you'll probably share some of those experiences. Why don't you introduce yourself to those who'll be watching this interview and tell who you are and what was your process? What brought you and your family to the United States as immigrants?
Sure. Thanks for that, Joel. So my name is Tabitha Sookdeo, and I'm currently living in New Haven in Connecticut. But my immigration story within the United States really started in Jacksonville, Florida. So that's sort of the lens through which I'll be speaking about my immigration story. And so the reason why my family came to the United States, I guess I should start about where we're from originally. So we're from Guyana, which is in South America. A lot of people actually don't know where that is, but it is right above Brazil, and it is on the right of Venezuela. And from since I was pretty young, we moved to a small island in the Caribbean called Saint Martin. And also some people don't know where that is, but if you tend to go on cruises, you normally know where it is. Half of the island is Dutch, the southern half is Dutch, and the northern part is French. And we lived on the Dutch side of the island. And I lived there for about 16 years on the Dutch side. And, the reason why we moved from Guyana was because of the abject poverty that was in our country and the lack of opportunities for jobs and things of that nature. My family, and my ancestors, really, I should say rather, they came from various regions of the world, particularly from the continent of Africa, from West Africa, like Ghana. And that's on my mom's side. And then on my dad's side, there were indentured servants that were taken from their homelands in India, from the eastern part of India, who were brought over to the British colonies. And so I think within my own life and within my ancestral journey, we have been folks that have moved from place to place, whether if it was forced or whether if it was in trying to find a better way of living. And so after moving from Guyana to St. Martin, it was really so that my family could have enough food to eat, have enough food to put on the table to eat, and to raise a family. And so after living there, we had to move because immigrants were not really welcomed in the best light. Because we were not local, oftentimes we'd be discriminated by the police, we'd be discriminated by government offices and things of that nature. I think the last straw for my father was when we had lived on the island for a long enough period of time to where we can actually apply for permanent residency.
Interject a question. When you say on the island that you were discriminated against, what was that discrimination based on?
Sure. So that discrimination was based on nationality. So the fact that we were not from St. Martin. And that's pretty clear. The island is majority Black. And even though my mom was Black and we were passable within the community, it really became apparent whenever we would go to try to get our government documents. Because what they would see our passport. They would see the fact that we were not from the island. And so back to sort of when my dad was trying to apply for us through all of the right ways, right, the right mechanisms, they actually told him that they would not be giving him anything unless they gave him money, you know, that he would to give them money. So it was a bribe. They wanted him to bribe them for $10,000 per, you know, per passport. And this is 10,000 United States dollars, by the way.
Right.
And so, you know, so that's just to really give a broad example of what happened. And they really threatened me, they threatened my status, and they said, well, you know, your daughter is 16 years now, and she'll have to leave the island, and I would have had to been sent back to Guyana. And so all of that to, you know, very long story to say that we came to the United States because my father already had family here. My grandmother was an American citizen, and we had most of his siblings were here. It's 5 girls, 5 boys. So most everyone was already living in the United States, within Florida, and also within New York. And so it was a pretty, it seemed like the most logical thing to do. And everyone's immigration story is quite different. And we had paperwork that was in. And so our lawyer actually advised us to go ahead and move to the United States. My family put all of their savings into a house in Florida. And we actually moved just before the Great Recession. So that was really tough.
Impeccable timing.
Impeccable, yes.
And
absolutely.
so that journey, when you came to the U.S., for most people, they don't understand the difference between visas. But what allowed you into the U.S. at that point? Because you didn't. I'm assuming you didn't like sneak across the border of Mexico or come down to Canada covertly, you know, in the dark of night.
Right. Yeah. And those are things that folks do because they don't have any other options, right? We were privileged enough to be able to afford a visa, actually a tourist visa, that allowed for us to enter into the United States. And based upon the advice of our attorney, who was not a very good attorney, by the way, they ill-advised us and said that, you know, within a couple of months, your paperwork will be ready. And so utilize the visa to get into the country, settle down within your home, and your green cards will be available shortly. And that was not the case. You know, fast forward now, oh my goodness, almost 16 years now, my family has not received their green card. So it's been a pretty tough journey.
Is there any way that you could guess the amount of money that your family has invested in attorneys and all of the immigration documents?
You know, that's a great question. I mean, I would say tens of thousands of dollars. I can't give you a specific number, but to the point where my family doesn't have any savings, right? Like they're living on a week-to-week basis, basically, right? So, and it was that because they trusted that the system would protect them, right? And would honor sort of their efforts. And so that has been a really interesting dynamic and wake-up call for me even.
So after you arrived in the U.S., you were still a teenager. What life looked like for you? I'm assuming you enrolled in public school. What happened in those, you know, subsequent years?
Sure. So, you know, when I went to school in the Caribbean, from 3rd grade, I learned about the American Civil Rights Movement, you know, and I had this perception in my mind that racism no longer existed. You know, I was always just so inspired by Harriet Tubman and MLK, you know, and these were all folks that we learned about thoroughly in the Caribbean, like as a 3rd grader in Dutch, by the way. And so when I was like, okay, great, we're going to the United States, there's progress, this is wonderful. It was a rude awakening when when I saw that my neighbors had, you know, lots of Confederate flags, like in front of their homes, and sort of like when you open the garage, it's on the back, kind of the back wall, just like as large as that wall. And for me, my perception of what that meant was that that was a sign of racism. right? Just the way that I had learned about it in the Caribbean. And I mean, going to school was also just very surprising because there weren't a lot of folks that looked like me. And it was pretty strange because I had a pretty thick Caribbean accent and people didn't understand me. They couldn't understand what I was saying. And so I was so embarrassed. And so I would go home and I would go in front of the bathroom mirror and try to practice my best American accent, like just super enunciating my words just so that people can understand what I was saying. And that was really tough. And lots of students, which I guess to no fault of their own, would be asking me questions like, do you have electricity from where you come from? Do you guys eat chicken? Things like that. So that was pretty strange, but I was lucky enough to be able to sort of formulate or foster an environment to where a community of people who were interested in learning and interested in sort of overcoming their own ignorance to really learn about my culture and to really help me out through high school and to feel welcomed. I know that's not the case for everyone.
Because as I've grown in friendship with you, you are a person who really grasps what it means to help people who don't understand. And you do that really well. You do it very patiently. And I think for a lot of people right now, especially with what's going on in the US, with all of the outrage over the conflict between law enforcement and specifically people of color, and coming off these demonstrations and riots and protests and prayer vigils, inspired by the tragic and horrible murder of George Floyd and others. And I think I'm seeing, I posted this the other day, I said, for the first time in 40 plus years of my life that I can remember, I'm noticing more white, specifically in my context, white evangelicals showing a genuine interest in learning. Not just talking about it, but actually learning. And so for those who might be watching this, who don't have a lot of exposure to conversations with people of color, first of all, like how do you describe, where do you fit in the color scheme of things? Do you consider yourself Black? Do you consider yourself a person of color? What is the language that you resonate with as you're talking through these issues with other people?
That is such an interesting question, particularly because, I am half Black. I'm half Black and I'm half Indian. And, it's hard for me to identify with being Indian. It's hard for me to resonate with being Indian because that's not really been part of my life. And it's been many, many, many generations ago, to the extent to which my family, who is of Indian descent, that lives in the Caribbean and who lives in South America, the language is gone, the culture is really gone, the religion is gone. It's really a couple of items of food really that remains. And so I grew up as within like a Black household. I grew up within Caribbean Black culture. And so for me, I resonate with, of course, like I say, I'm a mixed race person and I do identify as being a person of color. But there's so many complexities as it pertains to the racial composition of folks from the Caribbean and folks of the African diaspora. And so that's a real conversation to have been had. And it's not really something that a lot of folks talk about, even within the African American community. And I say all of that because when I first came to the United States, it was pretty difficult for me to be able to find sort of where I fit in, like with Black kids at school, I didn't have the same kind of understanding or experiences as far as what it meant to be an African American student, right? I had a much different experience as a Black Caribbean woman. And so to answer your question, that's where I see myself. I do identify as being a Black woman.
And I think in particular, because of these times that we're in, as I've talked with friends who've not engaged in these types of conversations before, I say be genuine and don't use a lot of words when you ask your questions of someone, a person of color specifically. Just say things like, I don't know what I'm supposed to ask, but I want to learn.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine said last night, he said, one thing I know is I don't know what I don't know, and I
This
need
is
to
true.
learn. And so I know that in learning, I have to be quiet and listen. But I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's the responsibility of those who, especially, are in a place of privilege and advantage because of their ethnic background, because of their skin color, because of their accent.
Mm-hmm.
They have a more of a responsibility to engage. So how does that blend? Being a person of color in Florida, in Jacksonville,
Mm-hmm.
who's also an immigrant, at some point your tourism visa probably ran out. So how did that affect your status?
Yeah, so it ran out pretty quickly. And so what that then meant was that I had no status. Um, and so it was undocumented for a number of years. And within Florida, it's actually very difficult to be an undocumented immigrant. And I would say even more difficult in North Florida. People don't really think about sort of the privileges that come with status, right? Like, for example, driving, right? You can't get a driver's license if you're undocumented. And so how do you get from place to place? It's not normal to see somebody really walking down the road in Florida, especially in Jacksonville. Even if there are ginormous sidewalks, people just don't do that. And so things like getting groceries was so hard for us, you know. And it seems like it's something that people didn't really consider, and they never really thought about it. But getting groceries was so incredibly difficult. And you know, we have to try to get as many things as possible to be able to store, right? So lots of like canned foods, lots of frozen vegetables and things of that nature. And I think like even within that, just like even within food, like I felt lesser not being able to eat like fresh food. And that seems kind of strange to say, but it was how I felt, especially as a teenager, and especially as um, seeing different students and seeing the way in which that they were living.
Right.
1 second, Joel.
Is your husband
Yep. Just like
more than welcome to join the interview, right?
right. It's like thank you.
Yeah, I
Uh,
have signs posted around my house because it's 11:30 in the morning, and my kids are probably going to start waking up sometime now. They're scared.
oh, they're still asleep. That's nice.
They stay up till 2 and sleep in till 2. So
Oh my
not
goodness.
really, but
Sure.
here we are. I know it's really easy to look at the despairing moments of this journey, especially for
Mm-hmm.
people. Right now in the United States, we're waiting to hear um, the the response from the Supreme Court on the
Mm-hmm.
issue of DACA, the Deferred Action
Sure.
on Childhood Arrivals and
Mm-hmm.
Dreamers, and there's a lot of tension surrounding that.
Mm-hmm.
So in the midst of that, and I know you have a lot of friends who are dreamers,
Mm-hmm.
how do we find hope in the midst of this? Where do you find hope? Maybe that's a tricky question.
Yeah, no, it's so one thing was that I unfortunately did not qualify for DACA.
Okay.
Um, you know, even though I had all of the requirements, and it was only because of one thing. It was because we entered the United States in 2008 as opposed to 2007. So my sister and I, my brother, we missed it by a year. And so that was always extremely crushing because it always felt like we were so close, but then so far. And so with DACA, I've met some of my closest friends in Nashville, in Tennessee, And I've really had the privilege of being surrounded by so many DACA students in Nashville. When I was in Florida, it was actually like I didn't really know very many people who didn't have papers, because it was also a time before DACA even came out, right? And so, because I'm a little older than most of the DACA students, and so nobody would say that they're undocumented, and so it would actually take years later until like now, 8 years later, where people are telling me, I was actually undocumented when I was in high school, but I never said anything because I was too scared. And same with me, I never really talked about it. But being surrounded by folks who have DACA, I know that it is an extremely just difficult time, because oftentimes the people who have DACA, they're the only ones in their families that are able to drive, right? Because you can't have a license if you don't have some paperwork that allows for it, are the only ones who are able to work, right, legally. And so that's hard, just even being able to support your family, right? Your larger family, you have this incredible weight on your shoulders of ensuring that your siblings and that your parents have enough food to eat, right? And that coupled with now not even having these like very basic sort of amenities, right? But then also having your dreams to go to school being on hold. That's crushing. That is hard. That is so hard. And I think adding an additional layer is if you have a degree that you've gotten from school, right? And you put in all of those really hard hours, working 2 part-time jobs to support your family, taking 5 to 6 years to finish your undergraduate degree because of all of these obligations, then being told, oh, you can't work anymore, you can't find a job anymore, and you have a degree. It's a lot. It's really tough. And the last thing I'll say about that too is there's a lot of real fear around the government actually having, addresses of DACA students, right? That's another thing that people are really worried about. If this program is discontinued and then you no longer have status, the government has a pretty extensive list of your addresses, and lots of other kinds of information. So that's very stressful.
And it's challenging for those of us who are even in the work of advocacy to find those places of hope. We know that this is a very stressful time for people whose immigration status is at risk, especially in the political environment that we're in. There's not a lot of hope that people are in power right now are making efforts to encourage immigration. So you and I could talk all day about some of these challenges, but
sure,
for the point of listeners who may not have that amount of time to just hang out with you and me, what is the work that you're doing right now, and how does being an immigrant play into what you're doing? How does that move into your work?
Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't answer fully your question about sort of how I can find hope within sort of everything that's happening.
Right.
No, but I think it also just goes back to that community of people, to DACA students. I think having that community and knowing the hearts of those folks, I think gives me a lot of hope. And to answer your question now, so I work at a refugee resettlement agency, and we help refugees, but it's not only that. We also help immigrants from other walks of life, whether if they have DACA, if they're undocumented, if they're an asylum seeker. And I think being able to do that work and to help folks and to give back in that way, even as being an immigrant, is something that's incredibly important to me, because this is something that I always have inside of me, and I always think, wow, I only wish that I had something like so it's called IRIS, the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services organization. I only wish that there was something like that, and folks who would have been available for my family when we first came. If I only wish that that was something that we had. And so for me, I always try to think about, who is the person that I needed when I was a child, when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult. Like what were some of those things and those characteristics of people and of organizations that I really needed. And I take that very seriously, and I take that as a responsibility to enact that, if that helps to answer some of those questions. And so through doing that work on a day-to-day basis is sort of how I advocate, on top of other ways of advocacy, whether if it's talking to groups of folks about my story and about what the challenges are of other folks. But I think really also listening and finding ways to help people who are ready to learn about this work, and being patient and trying to be understanding, and trying to sort of start that process of reconciliation is really my strategy, and what I really hold true to.
I'm eternally thankful that our paths have crossed. And I remember the first time you and I met, I'd heard your story because you were this dynamic, robust young woman of force who spoke before political leaders on Capitol Hill, and your story was compelling and people wanted to hear it. And then I remember, as a pastor of a smaller church in Central Florida, we were just going to have a round table talking about immigration. We showed the Stranger film, Welcoming the Stranger, and then you came and shared your story with that group of people. And that night ignited a fire within me I was already compelled to advocate on behalf of immigrants, but your story, your experience lit a fire that really leads to where I'm working and serving today. So if you had a window of opportunity to speak to someone, originally I was going to ask you what advice you would give to immigrants considering coming to the United States, but I think you have a perspective that would be able to say to somebody who's weighing out what it means to be an advocate for immigrants, and maybe they don't have a job with a refugee resettlement organization, maybe they're not going to be a mobilizer for a national immigration forum.
Sure.
Maybe they're working in a business or running their home. What is a piece of advice you would have for people who are weighing out how they would use their voice for immigrants?
Yeah. So hearing the last part of what you said, using their voice, right? I think it's not as intuitive, right? It's not using your voice as a person and allowing for the voices of others to be elevated and to be heard, right? That's the first thing I would say. Because even, within everything that's happening in the world and sort of this push for anti-racism work, that's one of the first tenets, really. And what we can see very quickly is how a lot of anti-racism work and how immigration advocacy work really comes together, and how they're almost all in the same, because at the end of the day, it's about power, right? And it's about whiteness, and sort of how white supremacy culture is pervasive in our society. So I think a lot of it is really just listening, and there kind of been threads of this as we've been speaking today, and not assuming the worst, right? Or just like assuming someone's experience. But I think that is absolutely the very first thing that folks have to do.
And there's our alarm. It's probably time for us to wrap this up. Tabitha, thank you so much for sharing your story. And we will continue to advocate and support your family as they're still navigating 16 years of hardship, wanting to live as good neighbors, as people who can use their voice and their passion to love people. Your mom is one of my biggest fans, so I'm just going to keep cheering for her and giving her place to speak and move. May
She
God,
prays for you every day, by the way, for you and your family.
I know she does, and I depend on it. So, well, may God bless you, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I look forward to sharing this with other people. I know they'll be inspired by your story.